year, usually in the fall. So we think a little bit about stewardship and about giving. You know, stewardship is really an issue of trust. Do we believe, do we trust that God is faithful? Do we really trust that if God calls us to give, and if He's promised that He's going to take care of us, that's going to happen? That even though we give to His work some of what is ours on this earth, that we're not going to miss it, that God's going to care for us even in the midst of that. Do we really believe, do we really trust that we can be better, happier, more at peace by giving than by keeping everything for ourselves? Stewardship is really an issue of trust. Now, a lot of times we talk about stewardship in terms of selfishness or selflessness. We can talk about stewardship in terms of law, that we are to, give a tenth. And those things are also true. But I think bottom line, stewardship is an issue of trust and faith. I'm going to read from the Gospel of Mark, two miracles, one following immediately on the other in the Gospel of Mark. Two miracles that happened that really deal with this whole issue of really knowing who God is, who Christ is, and trusting Him. First of all, from Mark 6, starting at verse 35. I'm going to start up in the middle of this simply because by reading these two together, which by the way, as we're going to see, belong together, get a little lengthy. So I'm going to start kind of in the middle of this. Jesus has been with His disciples and a large crowd of people teaching all day long. Now it's evening. They're tired. That is, Jesus and the disciples are tired. The people are hot and hungry. And so the disciples come to Jesus to take care of this issue, really. By this time, it was late in the day. So His disciples came to Him. "This is a remote place," they said, "and it's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But He answered, "You give them something to eat." They said to Him, "It would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat?" "How many loaves do you have?" He asked. "Go and see." When they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. Taking the 5 loaves and 2 fish and looking up to heaven, He gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then He gave them to His disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of men who had eaten was 5,000. Immediately, Jesus made His disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of Him to Bethsaida, where He dismissed the crowd. While He dismissed the crowd, after leaving them, He went up on a mountainside to pray. Later that night, the boat was in the middle of the lake, and He was alone on land. He saw the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. Shortly before dawn, He went out to them walking on the lake. He was about to pass by them. But when they saw Him walking on the lake, they thought He was a ghost. And they cried out because they all saw Him and were terrified. Immediately He spoke to them and said, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid." Then He climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. Interesting, that last verse and a half. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Mark ties this last amazing event, miracle of Jesus walking on the water, to the miracle that preceded it, the breaking of the loaves and the fish and the feeding of the 5,000. Interestingly, did you know this? There's only one miracle that's recorded in every one of the Gospels, in all four of them. Did you know that? And it is the feeding of the 5,000, this first one we read. The only miracle that is recorded in every one of the Gospels. And that speaks to the significance, the importance of that event. Three of the Gospel writers, Luke excluded, Matthew, Mark, and John, all include the story of Jesus walking on the water. These two events happened in all three Gospels, and in reality, undoubtedly, one following the other. So Jesus fed the 5,000 men, not counting women and children. Then he sent his disciples out on the Sea of Galilee to go to the other side while he went up the mountainside and prayed. And then he began to walk across the water to the other side that same evening. Mark ties those two together by saying they did not understand about the loaves. What they experienced, both the fear of what they thought was a ghost and the amazement that it was in fact Jesus walking on the water, and it was Jesus calming down the winds, they should not have felt either one of those things. They should have recognized, according to Mark, from the breaking of the bread that Jesus could do such a thing, and not been amazed. They should have known that Jesus had the power to break the bread and feed 5,000 with 5 loaves, that he had the power to walk on the waves and to calm the storm. They saw what Jesus did, you understand. They saw Jesus feed the 5,000, but somehow it didn't sink in. They didn't get it. Both of these miracles, but thinking especially of that first one, was meant to be a pointer to Jesus as the sovereign, divine Son of God. And the disciples didn't get it. Interestingly, if you read the same stories in Matthew, when Jesus gets into the boat on the stormy Sea of Galilee, the disciples say, "Truly, you are the Son of God." At the end of the second miracle in Matthew, they finally get it. Jesus is amazing. Jesus is the Son of God. He has power over the winds. He had power over the 5 loaves to feed 5,000. They finally get it. Also, interestingly, in the Gospel of John, these two events are followed up by Jesus talking to the crowd. The crowd had left the one side of the Sea of Galilee, walked around to the other side to find him again. When they found him, they were once again communicating back and forth. You know what they said? "Give us a sign." Isn't that amazing? They had just been fed, 5,000 of them, by 5 loaves and 2 fish. They knew that Jesus had gone to the mountainside to pray, and the next day he was across the lake, had no idea what had happened in the night, but knew that somehow he had gotten over there. And what did they do? Give us a sign. They asked for more. Where's the faith? How can we be so blind that God can act and we don't see it? See, these miracles, this first one especially of the feeding of the 5,000, are meant to show that Jesus was the divine Son of God, and that God is sovereign over all things. God can do the impossible. He can make the impossible possible. He can feed 5,000 people, men, not counting women and children, with 5 little loaves and 2 little fish, because God is sovereign over all things. God has the power to calm the stormy sea, or in the person of a human being, Jesus, walk across the water. God is more powerful than things of this world because God is sovereign. And we're supposed to see that. The disciples were supposed to see that, but they were amazed. They hadn't understood about the loaves because their hearts were hardened. Their eyes weren't open. We need to recognize who it is that we worship every Sunday. We need to recognize that we worship the sovereign Lord of the universe. And that means that, folks, there's nothing on this earth or in hell below that we need to be afraid of. Because the sovereign Lord of the universe is our God, and He loves us. And we need have no fear. You know, it is amazing what God has done at Christ Community Church. And I wonder if our eyes are opened enough to see how God has been at work. How God has used us in amazing ways. How God has answered prayers and given healing and provided resources. And are our eyes opened to see how God is moving among us, confirming to us His promises. We have to recognize who it is as a church and who it is individually that we serve. And we don't need to have any fear. So what's that got to do with stewardship? Well, here's what it's got to do with stewardship. When we recognize that we serve a sovereign God who controls all things, who does the impossible, it really should remove all fear, all anxiety from our lives. Think about these disciples. Jesus says to them, feed this large group. They say to Jesus, hey, it's getting late. These folks are hungry. Send them out and get them something to eat. Let them find food. And Jesus said, no, you take care of them. It's your job. Feed them. And the disciples go, wow, half a year's wage wouldn't feed these people. If we had it, they're saying to Jesus, which we don't, would you really want us to spend that much money on one evening feeding this crowd? And Jesus said, well, if you don't have it, what do you have? Go find out. Oh, we got 5 loaves and 2 fish. In the hands of Jesus, 5 loaves and 2 fish is 12 basketfuls more than you need to feed 5,000 people. Because God is sovereign. And if the disciples could just have trusted and understood that, they wouldn't have been afraid on the Sea of Galilee. They would have recognized that Jesus is sovereign, and we may be in trouble out here on the land or on the ocean, and we may see this phantasm walking across the water, and why would they think it was anything other than a ghost? That we may see this thing, but we're Jesus people, they would have thought. And He's sovereign. And we don't have to be afraid of the sea, and we don't have to be afraid of the ghost, because God is over all of that. You see, God is a God of abundance. God is a sovereign God who cares for us and is able to do the impossible. As I think about that, David Mporampora, who's a friend of mine, who's the director of Christ Aid that we have a church have been working with for over a decade, working in Uganda. I think of David Mporampora. David has always said, if God gives the vision, He'll give the provision. I love that line. If God gives the vision, He'll give the provision. Feed 5,000 people. How? Jesus will give the provision. He'll do it. You just start handing out the food. If God gives the vision, He'll give the provision. You know, God has given to us as a church a vision for what He wants us to be. A church that reaches out to the community, that shares the love of Christ with people all around us. And frankly, folks, we don't have the wherewithal to do it. But God can do the impossible because He is sovereign over all things. And He has touched hearts of people to give abundantly, way beyond what we might imagine. I don't know if you've all heard, the word is out a little bit. I don't know if you've all heard about the unbelievable gift that was given to us or will be given to us in a week and a day. I got a call about a month ago or so from a family who lives in our community, not a part of this church, that live in the community, and shorten the story a little bit, but of all things, they have 6 cemetery plots at the cemetery across the street from us that they want to give to us. 6 cemetery plots that we can sell and use the money for God's kingdom. Now, who in the world would have dreamt that one up? But when God gives the vision, you see, He gives the provision. And that's not only true for us as a church, it's true for each one of us individually. When God calls us to be His people, He challenges us to trust Him. And when we do that, when we're willing to trust God with all of our lives, including that which is most closest to our hearts, our money, when God gives the vision, He will give the provision as well. What this passage asks us is, are we as a people going to be God-dependent or self-dependent? The disciples, when Jesus said, feed this group, they took it on themselves. We would need half a year's wages. We can't do that. And Jesus says, I'll do it. You go see what's available. I'll take care of it. They get out into the stormy Sea of Galilee, and they're working hard against the oars because the wind's against them. And all the time, Jesus is there, and He comes out and quiets the storm, and they go to the other side of the sea. Are we going to be self-dependent or God-dependent? See, it's so easy when God calls us to give to believe, yes, but I've got to take care of myself. I've got a family. I've got a 401k. I've got the future to think about. I've got to do all this stuff. And do we really then trust God to care for us? Are we believing that God will be faithful to His promise that if we seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, all of that other stuff will be given to us as well? See, stewardship is about trust. Stewardship is about believing that when we respond to God in faith, that He's going to take care of us individually and as a church. My prayer is that God will give us open eyes to see who it is we worship every Sunday. Open eyes to see how God is miraculously working in our midst as a church. Open eyes to see how God has miraculously worked in our lives to take care of us. And then, after He gives us open eyes, I pray that God will give us responsive hearts to do whatever He's calling us to do, to give to the work of His kingdom whatever He's calling us to give. He fed 5,000 men, not counting women and children, 5 loaves. He can multiply whatever we have to fill our needs. He can multiply whatever we have as a church to meet the needs to do whatever He calls us to do. Let's pray. Lord, we thank You for these